So today I finally watched the film that a lot of people have talked about, and that is The Exorcist Believer. I have not heard one good thing about this movie. When I first saw the trailer months and months ago, I thought to myself, okay, this movie actually looks promising, right? It looked creepy. There was some creepy imagery there. The girls' faces while they were together looked eerie and disturbing and a little bit just creepy. And I thought, well, this film looks promising. But then one day I started watching this film review that YouTube recommended to me. So I thought, okay, YouTube knows what I'm interested in. The algorithm knows. So I clicked on the video, started watching it. And the guy doing the review basically said that this film is complete trash and that it had zero redeeming qualities and that it was just complete trash. It was complete garbage. The movie is supposed to be a direct sequel to the original Exorcist that everyone talks about and that everyone esteems as the greatest horror film ever made. And I mean, arguably, yeah, it is the best horror film ever made. And the people who did the movie, the studio, I guess, they paid $400 million to buy the rights to The Exorcist, to the copyright or whatever it is to The Exorcist. And they brought in the woman who played the mom in the original Exorcist movie. They actually brought her over to the film, and I heard that she really wasn't too crazy about the movie from the beginning. And I just heard nothing good about this film. And one of the biggest criticisms that I've heard about this movie is that they really just did no justice to the original. They did not honor the original. And they brought in the woman who played the mom. So they brought the mom from the original film to this movie, and they didn't really do her justice at all. I mean, they just have her come. The dialogue is awful. It's just the film is just terribly directed, and then they finish her off. So they have her come they have her in the movie. They put her in this scene. She's talking about her experiences. She's talking about her daughter. Blah 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 blah. And then she visits the girl who's possessed by a demon, and then the possessed girl grabs this woman and stabs both of her eyeballs with a pair of scissors, and they finish her off. The film just finishes this woman off, and she's gone. She doesn't have any serious role at all. She's just there just for marketing, just to show people in the trailer, look, we brought the mom from the original Exorcist, and it's just a marketing gimmick. That's all it really is. They try to use this woman as a selling point, and that's all it really is. And the film was, I watched it today, and I can confirm that all of the criticism about this movie is extremely deserved. It's completely deserved. This film is complete crap. But anyone who has seen this film knows that already, so I don't really have to get too much into why this film sucks. But what I will say is that this movie is terribly directed. Terribly directed. There is zero character development in this movie. There's no character development. It's just you don't really get a chance to get familiar with these characters. They don't really build the story in a way where you become emotionally invested in the characters. So when you look at the original Exorcist, you have Father Damien Karas, who is this Greek American priest living in the middle of downtown, whatever, Chicago. And he lives in the middle of this terrible city, and he's taking care of his mom. And so he likes to box, to exercise, and to release stress. And on top of it, he's this priest who has studied human psychology. He's I think a psychiatrist by trade, and we really, really get to know this guy. We understand that he feels this horrible trauma because he comes to the point where he is not really able to adequately take care of his mother. And so the mom has to go to essentially an insane asylum. The mom has to go to an asylum for the insane, and he can't take care of her. And then eventually, the mom passes away. So we are the film, the original Exorcist, did a really good job in building emotional investment, right? Building these characters so that the audience can grow familiar with the character and feel sorry for the character and to have sympathy and empathy for the character. So that when the film reaches its climax or reaches the point where it's at its scariest, right, which is at the end of the movie, and there's that scene when Father Kados is in the room and the old man has to take a break. The more mature, more experienced priest, Father Marin, who's another very interesting character, he has to go take a break because he has a very weak heart. And there's Father Caras, and he's trying to take care of this girl, and this girl begins to mimic his mother. And Father Caras has this very emotional reaction to this demon, and he screams at this demon. He's screaming at the girl, but he's really screaming at the demon. And at that point, you feel for him because you've already seen what he has gone through. He's taking care of his mom. Mom goes to the crazy house. Mom dies. He feels bad about that, and you feel bad because if you were put in his situation, you would feel terrible. So there is familiarity that is built between the character and the audience. Same thing with Father Marin. Father Marin is this archaeologist, and the first scene of The Exorcist is just one of the greatest scenes ever made in cinema. I mean, really, I will die on this hill. It is one of the greatest scenes ever directed in the history of film directing. It is so beautifully done. It's in Iraq. Father Marin is in Baghdad somewhere. He's in this archaeological site. He's digging for Babylonian, Sumerian, ancient Mesopotamian artifacts. And he finds this ancient coin from the Middle Ages. And then eventually he finds this little idol depicting the Mesopotamian demon Pazuzu. And that's when everything begins to turn very, very weird and creepy and eerie. And you can feel the eeriness in the scene. And I think that's another mark of really good directing is the actors aren't just doing things, or things aren't just happening to the characters to make you feel disturbed or to make you have an emotional or psychological reaction. The environment is also affecting you psychologically. So when you watch a film like Hereditary is one of the greatest, if not the best example of this. When you watch the film Hereditary, which came out in 2018, one of the greatest horror films ever made, that whole movie, as you're watching it, feels eerie. And even when nothing is happening, the feeling from the atmosphere in the movie is eerie. And that's why they call it atmospheric horror. And I love that term, atmospheric horror. So what's happening to the characters is not the only thing that's supposed to make you have a reaction. It's also the atmosphere and the scenes. And the atmosphere has to convey to the audience the message that something is very, very wrong. Because in reality, when something is wrong, you feel it. Even when what you're worrying about is not happening, you feel worried. And this is just human nature. It's just reality. When something terrible is happening in your life, even when that terrible thing is not happening at an exact moment, when you're just doing your day-to-day activities, when you're just cooking or eating dinner or reading or doing work or whatever, you constantly feel off because something is off. The entire environment in your life changes. Well, in order for art to be effective, art has to reflect reality. It has to reflect real life. So when you look at a really good film, be it horror, be it a thriller, be it a drama, the scenes have to have an atmosphere. The entire film has to have an atmosphere that conveys a particular feeling, that conveys the feeling that the movie is based on. If a film is based on the feeling of horror or the feeling of dread or the feeling of suspense, the atmosphere in the scenes need to make the audience feel that. One of the ways that good movies, really well directed films, do that is by the texture of the film. So when you look at a film like Hereditary, Hereditary has this texture. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but there's this dim texture. If you ever just watch the film Hereditary, you'll know what I'm talking about. You have to see it to understand. There's just this texture on the film, and the texture is dim. It's kind of empty. It's a little bit melancholic. And that texture already immerses or helps to immerse the audience into the feeling of what is happening. Another great example, and this is not a film that is very well known, but to me is one of the best examples of a good horror film. It's The Black Coat's Daughter. Not a very well known movie, very obscure. It's actually directed by the son of the guy who played the Psycho in the film Psycho, which was really the first serious horror movie. And that movie has a texture that is constantly making you feel that something terrible is about to happen, and that evil is lurking everywhere. And that's what the film depicts. The film depicts evil and the effects of evil, but it also depicts evil in a very spiritual way. And that's really the main point of this video, and that is the depiction of evil and how a film like The Exorcist Believer does not do the theme of evil any justice, if that makes any sense. The difference between The Exorcist Believer and a really good horror film, as I've already said, is character development, but also atmosphere and pacing. The Exorcist Believer has terrible pacing. Terrible pacing. The film just feels rushed constantly. And there's this very, very stupid message in the movie that is one of universalism. And when movies try to convey particular messages, really good directors, experienced directors, and this is the difference between a really good movie and a mediocre movie or a terrible movie. A good director who has a message will illustrate the message and not preach the message, if that makes any sense. So if you look at the film like The Exorcist, just to go back to that one, because the Exorcist Believer is supposed to be a sequel to the original. The original Exorcist film shows Ouija board, and the girl kind of messes with the Ouija board, and she's talking with this person, this entity, who she calls, I think, Captain Howie or something. And because she messes with witchcraft, all these terrible things happen. Without the film telling you, or without the film preaching to you, the film is illustrating the danger of Ouija board. So there doesn't need to be a guy who gets up and says, this is why you don't mess with Ouija board. The film shows you. So it's showing as opposed to telling. And that's, I think, one of the biggest indications of a good film is that it shows as opposed to tells. The Exorcist Believer has a very, very horrible message of universalism. And it shows, but it also tells. So in the movie, this girl, these two girls are possessed, and they try to get a priest over, and the priest just doesn't want to do it. And then, so they bring in this shaman. And so they have a shaman, and they bring in a Protestant pastor, and they bring in a Roman Catholic. Eventually, the Roman Catholic priest does show up. But before the Roman Catholic priest shows up, they have this Catholic woman, and all together, they are doing an exorcism. So it's basically like, I don't know, the Justice League for exorcism. But all three of these people, they're in different, the Catholic and the Protestant are both in Christianity, but two different denominations, two different ways of looking at exorcism. The Catholic view of exorcism is actually serious and well-founded. The Protestant view is way too much based on Hollywood. I really feel that a lot of Protestant people who are into exorcism, I really believe that they just watched horror movies and then they said, oh, let's do that, we can do that sort of thing. Because Protestantism is not really known for exorcism, and then within recent decades, we've been hearing about Protestant ministers who do exorcism, I think they just watched Hollywood films and said, "Oh yeah, this can get us some more people to follow us or something like that as a marketing gimmick," because the Protestant church, at least now, doesn't really have a serious foundation for exorcism, whereas the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, they actually have serious ways of looking at exorcism and serious ways to approach exorcism. But the shaman woman, she has a completely different religion, and it's satanic. And she does literal shamanism in the movie, like actual shamanism in the film. She puts a magic circle on the floor, and they put the girl in the magic circle. And then the Protestant pastor all of a sudden thinks that it's legitimate to do an exorcism with a shaman voodoo wizard. And then the Roman Catholic comes along and she thinks that's okay. I mean, I guess that's realistic because you have the Pope who will go to some Pachamama idols. So I guess that part is realistic. But the fact is that the film shows voodooism actually being used as a way to do exorcism, which is just so insane because that would actually bring more demons to you. Then the father comes and he just gives the girl a scarf that belonged to her mom, and oh, here's the scarf. Then all of a sudden she starts getting healed. It's just the pacing is so terrible, and it just feels so rushed. But another thing that I really, really don't like about films like The Exorcist Believer and just a lot of exorcism movies in general is that they really, really make little of the reality of evil. They make little of it. They don't they, they don't depict it seriously. And the problem is that you have all of these people who watch these movies, and I think by watching too many of these films, what can happen is that people will not take seriously the reality of the diabolical, the reality of demons and Satan and evil. And what I hate about these films, one just to pile on and the list of the things I hate about these films is that, like I said, they make little of the reality, but the way that they do this is they'll show some girl doing a ritual or doing she'll dabble into something, I don't know, I don't, she'll do some witchcraft stuff. And all of a sudden she's possessed. And then they just put makeup on the character, they put blood on her face and make her look creepy and make her look like the girl from The Exorcist. And they'll say, okay, here she is, she's possessed. Okay, well, let's do it. Let's bring the priest. And they just follow the trope. And they're all trying to mimic the original Exorcist. The original Exorcist was great because it was very well directed, and plus it was the original. It was the original, but it was also ahead of its time, and it was very well directed. And so these films are all trying to mimic it, but they don't only mimic it, they take what is in the original Exorcist film and then they make it like a comic book. They make it comical. And what I don't like about these films being made over and over again like a broken record is that they're so tropey, they're so cookie cutter, and they're so unoriginal, and they're so just bland that they make very little of the reality of evil. They make it just comical. And they're not scary. They're just not. They're not scary. The original Exorcist is a creepy movie. While there are some scenes that are kind of comical in the original, I'm not gonna lie, like the head spinning thing, which is stupid. That's the one. There's a couple of things I don't like about the original Exorcist, and that is the head spinning. I think the head spinning thing is really dumb, and I understand that the producer and the original writer, the writer of the book, The Exorcist, upon which the whole film is based, had a whole argument about this. And I think the producer, I want to say it was the producer, wanted to do a head spinning scene. He thought that would be just so cool. Let's put a head spinning scene. And the writer said, no, that's not realistic. That's just so stupid. That's not what happens in real life. I mean, if a demon twists your head 180 degrees, you're dead. If your head twists all the way around, you're dead. You're not living. So that's just that scene with the head spinning is very, very comical. And also the scene where she walks backwards down the stairs, or she walks with her, I don't know how to say it. She walks with her palms on the stairs, but backwards. that was also kind of comical. But other than that, I mean, what makes that film creepy is the voice. That's the thing that makes that movie so creepy. Is the voice was done so. It was done well in the sense that it was done in a way that was just damn spine chilling. That voice is horrifying, and anyone who has seen The Exorcist will know what I'm talking about. It's a horrifying voice, and for some reason, other films who have tried to do films like The Exorcist have never really done a voice as creepy as the one in the original Exorcist. One thing that I don't like about these, another thing I should say, because I've been just compiling complaints in this movie, but another thing I don't like about these movies is that they're just not scary. They're not scary. And why are they not scary? Because they show things in these movies, they depict things in these films that just don't happen. For example, there's a scene in the movie The Exorcist Believer where this girl uh, is vomiting blood. She's just vomiting. She's just jetting out blood from her mouth, and the blood is hitting the ceiling, and just the blood is spreading all over the ceiling. And it's just, this is not scary because it doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. Now, there was a book I read years ago. Oh, man, what was it called? It was called An Exorcist Tells His Story. I forgot the name of the guy who wrote it, but he was the official exorcist for the Vatican. I just looked it up. His name is Gabriel Amorth, and he was the official exorcist for the Vatican for years. And he wrote an entire book on exorcism, and I read it. I read the whole book years ago. And that book, I'll be honest with you, I bought that book at Barnes& and Noble, and I remember going to the register to buy it, and the lady behind the register saw it, and you can tell she was the type of girl that was really into horror movies. You know what I'm talking about. She had that look of a girl who loves horror movies. And as soon as she saw the book, her eyes lit up, and she said, "Oh, wow, what's this one?" I said, "Oh, it's about exorcism. I just thought it would be interesting." She says, "I gotta read this. This looks so fascinating. I love the topic. I love the subject." And a lot of people, including myself, looked at that book thinking, this book is going to have stories in it that are like what we see in the Hollywood movies. And not really. There's a little bit of it in the book, but a lot of the book is actually quite bland. A lot of the book is actually quite unsurprising. I shouldn't say bland because that means boring. It's not really boring, but a lot of the things that are depicted in the book are not the crazy, out of control, just comical things that you see in Hollywood horror films. What you find in the book, what you find depicted in this book, is just stories showing various characteristics of exorcism, or of possession, I should say. There's no earthquakes, the house doesn't shake, there's nobody shooting blood from their mouth, and the blood jet shoots up like a jet from a water slide and hits the ceiling. There's none of that in the book. But what is depicted in the book is horrifying. It truly is. Because you would read the book and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to be hearing stories about people flying up in the air and houses shaking, and like you see in these movies. Or I'm going to see a story about a priest who gets his head twisted all the way around or something like that. And you don't see that. But what you find are depictions of evil. You find depictions of people who are constantly blaspheming, and that is in the original Exorcist. You find depictions of people who act in ways that is freaking creepy, really creepy. So, for example, there's a story that still sticks in my head that is recounted by Father Gabriel Amorth, and he talks about this young boy who's, I want to say, like 6, 7, or 8 years old, and I think it was his mom who was really concerned for him, and she said that my son is acting super weird for his age. He's talking about things that no one his age is going to be talking about. And the little boy is sitting at the couch. The priest, the exorcist, sits next to the young boy, and they start talking. And there's no, like I said, there's no crazy comical thing happening. No one's flying up in the air. But what is depicted in this story is creepy as hell. Because the young boy is talking about extremely complicated theological matters. Extremely complicated theological matters. This boy knew all these. He knew about the intricacies of the Godhead and just very complicated matters. And the priest said it is so strange that a boy this young knows about these things, and he hasn't studied these things. He hasn't opened up a book on theology and read about this stuff. He hasn't gone to university, and he knows about all this stuff. How does this happen? And the priest continues to interview this boy, and he says, "Well, young man, what do you think about people who say that God does not exist?" And the toddler looks at this priest and says, "Oh, Father, those people are speaking in error." And he was speaking very sophisticatedly. He spoke in a very sophisticated manner, very articulate, too articulate, especially for his age. And it wasn't Father Amorth who was involved in this exorcism. It was actually a priest named Father Candido. And Father Candido asked this boy, who was 11 years old, by the way. Father Candido asked this boy, "There are others who knowingly deny God with their will. What do you call these?" And this boy jumped up in a fury and said, "Be careful. Remember that we wanted to reclaim our freedom even before Him," meaning God. "We told Him no forever." And just imagine that. You have this 11-year-old boy who has this immense knowledge on theological matters, and then all of a sudden he starts speaking in this extremely diabolical way. That would make the hairs on my arms stand up. I could imagine a scene like that in a film done by a very capable director, showing a young boy who's super, super intelligent and they don't understand. And I would find that kind of creepy. But it's creepy. It really is creepy. And the reason why a lot of these horror movies today are not creepy is because they show things that don't happen. So you see a girl shooting blood from her mouth, and the idea of it sounds creepy, right? The idea of it sounds shocking and disturbing. Blood shooting out of a woman's mouth, and she's levitating up in the air, and the house is shaking, and all this stuff. But it's not scary because it doesn't happen. Now, shark movies are creepy. Shark movies are terrifying. Deep Blue Sea, Jaws especially. Really creepy movies. Why? Because you can imagine yourself in the ocean being attacked by a shark. That has actually happened. People get eaten by sharks. It happens. So it's horrifying. We know that possession happens. We know that Satan exists, demons exist. And so when we watch the film The Exorcist, and this horrifying voice is coming out of this woman's mouth and she's blaspheming constantly, that is creepy. I mean, that shit is creepy. It's creepy. The voice especially is horrifying. And really, I don't find the head spinning thing creepy, but I find the voice and the blasphemy that comes out of her mouth horrifying. Why? Because this happens. It does. It happens. So what is an example, in my opinion, of a film that is horrifying? That's truly horrifying. More horrifying than The Exorcist. More horrifying than The Exorcist. The most horrifying thing is human evil. And human evil is influenced by the diabolical. Human evil is inspired by demons. It's inspired by the demonic realm. And when that evil manifests itself, it's more horrifying than anything that you can imagine. And when a film accurately portrays this demonically inspired human evil, those films are more horrifying than any horror film that has ever come out. Ever. People read horror novels, right? Oh, I read this horror novel by whatever, Stephen King, and it was so creepy and blah, 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 blah. Well, try reading this book, The Third Reich. Make sure the camera gets it there. Yeah, try reading this book. I'm almost done with this book. I'm about, I got about 50-something pages to go. No, less than that, 40-something pages to go. I'm going to try to finish it tonight. I really hope I get it done. It's a very long read, 812 pages on the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And I was reading this part today about what happened when the Soviet Union what happened when the Soviet Union entered Belarus to retake Belarus from the Germans. And the Russians, the Red Army, when they entered Belarus, or Belorussia as it is sometimes called, they found something that the book calls a desert zone or desert area. I think it's a desert zone. I'll read it in a little bit here. And in this zone, they found 1,000,000 homes burned down. 1,000,000 homes. Just imagine that. 1,000,000 homes burned down. And they found no human life. They found neither Jew nor Slav in this zone. They found just death, dead bodies, burned down homes, abandoned homes. And I was reading about this in the book, and I thought to myself, now this is horror. This is horror. And the Germans in Belarus, they tried to cover up for their crimes. And they made these giant, deep pits full of dead bodies, mass graves. And they wanted to make sure that the Red Army would not find these mass graves. So the Germans began to disinter the mass graves, and they burned the bodies and made them into ashes. And that was one of the reasons why they didn't find any life in this area. 1,000,000 burned down homes, no life, nothing, just dead silence and the atmosphere of pure horror. Pure horror. Now, there was a saying that I heard not too long ago, and it really, really stuck to me. And it went, I forgot who said it, but it went something like this. Horror in art it lures us, right? It's magnetizing. It's fascinating in a very moribund way. Evil in real life is dreadful. It is dead. It is dry. And it gives us nothing but an internal feeling of emptiness. And you can imagine a film scene depicting what the Red Army witnessed in Belarus. And you can imagine a horrifying scene with very creepy atmospheric music, atmospheric sound, a feeling of eeriness. And you would say, wow, this film is wonderfully directed. But if you were a member of the Red Army in Belarus, actually walking through the dead zone, you would feel nothing but dread inside. And there would be nothing of artistic value experienced at all in that moment. Nothing. You would have the feeling of horror, and you would have the feeling of being disturbed, and you would have the feeling of being horrified. You would have the feeling of being completely shaken at your bones. Completely shaken. And the last thing that you would be thinking about in that moment would be art. You wouldn't be thinking about artwork, because it's truly horrifying. Now, there was a movie that depicted what happened in Belarus or Belarusia, and it was a very well-directed film called Come and See. One of the greatest films I've ever seen. Truly a masterpiece. I did a video not too long ago about the top 10 Slavic films, in my opinion, and I put that movie on the number 1 spot of the list because it truly is a masterpiece. For years, I had resisted watching the movie because, from the looks of it, it looked like one of those typical Eastern European movies where characters just look at each other for 10 minutes straight, and they have these very prolonged scenes, and nothing happens. And I watched the film, and my expectations were completely shocked and surprised. But there's a scene in the movie where a massacre happens, and the film is building up to this scene. There's not a whole lot of violence that happens in the movie until this scene, but in the movie, before this extremely horrifying scene is portrayed, there are these little things. I shouldn't say little, but they are certain things that are witnessed that foreshadow this final scene of horror. And the scene is that of a massacre done by the SS Delavanger, which was basically an SS unit full of people from prisons and crazy houses. And this whole village is wiped out. And the people are forced into a barnyard, and the whole barn is lit on fire, and people are shot, and this girl is gang raped by these SS officers, and it's hell. It's completely hell. but the film it accurately depicts what happened in Belarus, and it gives you just one example of a million examples that took place, a million occurrences of horror that took place in Belarus. And all of that horror accumulated into what the Red Army witnessed when it entered Belarus. And I'll read to you what the author of this book wrote about it, Michael Burleigh. And the way he writes it, it really conveys a message of horror. So he says, first, as the Russians crossed Belorussia, they encountered a desert zone with 1 million houses burned, crops deliberately plowed under, and no evidence of livestock. Men had either defected to the partisans or had been abducted for forced labor in Germany. And so far as the cities and towns had not been destroyed, Russian sappers had to deactivate, as in Minsk, up to 4,000 delayed action bombs, mines, and booby traps. There was no trace of the Jews, either alive or dead, although this was not a major concern to Soviet forces. The book also talks about what happened during the Warsaw Uprising in Poland, and I read about this today in the book. And the people in the city of Warsaw were tired of living under the reign of terror of Nazi occupation, so they decided to do an uprising, famously known as the Warsaw Uprising. And the people in Warsaw rebelled against Nazi occupation, and the Germans massacred the Poles in Warsaw. And the book talks about how the Germans took 40,000 Polish civilians and did a mass execution of all of them. All of them. And there was just horrendous massacres. And the Germans, alongside their Azeri auxiliaries, they don't talk about this a lot in history, but it is a fact that when the Germans were butchering the Poles, they brought over Azeris and Ukrainians to help them massacre the Polish people. It's a fact of history. It's something that's almost never talked about, and it's very surreal that Azerbaijanis were in Poland killing Polish people at one point in time. I shouldn't say funny enough, ironically enough, and disturbingly enough, Israel is a big ally to Azerbaijan, and Israel loves to bash Poland and Armenia, and the Azeri Turks have been killing the Armenians, so much for never again. But anyway, in one instance, in the massacre of the Polish people during the Warsaw Uprising, the Germans, the SS officers, and their Azeri and Ukrainian auxiliaries went into hospitals and they butchered the patients in the hospitals, and they would take the women in the hospitals and rape them. And as I was reading this, it reminded me of what happened in Sabra and Shatila. What happened in Sabra and Shatila in 1982. The Lebanese phalangists, who were just Lebanese fascists, really just Nazis, who were people who claimed to be Catholic, people who claimed to follow Jesus, the one who said to love other people, to love your enemies and love your neighbor. These Nazis, they went into the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, and they did a massacre for 3 days, all while the Israelis facilitated it. And what a lot of people don't talk about is that a lot of the people who were butchered by the Lebanese phalangists were not even Palestinian. They were Lebanese. And today, Lebanese nationalists who are of the Maronite Catholic religion will say, well, we had to do these things because we were fighting terrorism. And they are Maronite Lebanese who don't even deny that there was a massacre. They are Maronite Lebanese who will speak proudly of what the phalangists did, and they will justify it by saying that we were fighting terrorism. And the German Nazis were saying the same thing, that they were in Warsaw to fight terrorism. Well, if you were there strictly to fight Palestinian terrorism, why did you butcher your fellow Lebanese people? They butchered Lebanese people who were in the Sabra and Shatila camps. There was one Lebanese woman who they interviewed afterwards, and as she was walking away from the corpses, she saw a Palestinian man hanging from a meat hook like cattle in a slaughterhouse, and his body was split in two. almost split in half, hanging from a meat hook like some animal. And there was a Jewish American woman who was in a hospital during the massacre, and she was there as a volunteer. And she recounted in an interview how there was a Palestinian man in the hospital, and he begged the nurses for a doctor's coat so that the phalangist wouldn't kill him. They gave him the coat. The phalangist came in. They immediately knew that he was Palestinian just by looking at him. And Lebanese know when a Palestinian is there. I know it's crazy, right? Because they all look alike. But a Leb can definitely identify a Palestinian just like a Chinese can identify a Japanese and vice versa. They took the Palestinian man, they forced the nurses to walk down the hallway, and this nurse recounted how she turned around and she saw this Palestinian man on his knees begging for his life. She turned her head, and all she could hear was the gunshot.
We're talking on walkie-talkies. There was constant communication with someone. There was a Palestinian who had been working in the hospital who did not flee when the rest of them did. And he was terrified, and he asked for someone to give him a lab coat. And so we gave him a lab coat. But, of course, he was picked out immediately because he looked very different than these white and blonde and Scandinavian and American and British health workers. And I turned around, I saw him on his knees pleading, and I was told to keep walking. And the next thing I heard was a shot. I never looked back.
That's horror. That's horror. And they did a film depicting this sort of violence in Lebanon. It was called, and I can't pronounce French very well, but it was something like Incendiaire. And this film was a masterpiece. Somebody asked me in the last live stream that I did, what was the best film that I've seen so far this year? And I will definitely say it was this movie. It was beautifully directed. It was very depressing. But it depicts what the Phalangists did to the Palestinians during the Lebanese Civil War in the 1980s. It's horrifying. It truly is horrifying. It's horror. Why? Because these things happen. What makes something horrifying is relatability. A film has to depict something that actually can happen and still happens and happened in the past. Because if the film shows you something that just never happens, like a house is shaking in the middle of a suburban neighborhood while a priest is doing an exorcism, or while a voodoo shaman is doing an exorcism, it's not scary because that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. But showing a massacre of innocent civilians, that's horrifying. It is. It's why one of the scariest films that I've ever seen was a movie called it was called Children of Men. It came out back in 2009, I believe. Very, very good movie. And I've watched that film several times, and every time I have seen the movie, it still creeps me out. There's nothing supernatural in the movie. There's no demons in the film, but the film shows a refugee camp, and it shows the refugee camp being annihilated. And every time I see that scene, it horrifies me because I know that that's exactly what happened in the early 80s in Lebanon. And I know that this is what's going on right now in the Middle East. And I know that these things, they're still going to go on. They're still going to go on. And you never know when it may just be your neighborhood when that sort of thing could happen. And, yeah, it's horrifying. Saving Private Ryan, truly a horror movie. Outbreak, horror movie. Why? Because these things have happened, and they still happen, and they will happen. And that's what makes a film horrifying. That's what makes a movie horrifying. It's horrifying because it shows things that have happened, that still happen, and that will happen. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.